Hello, my name is Manuel Fimbres, and today is a very special day. Not because it's the 29th of October, but today is the day when I will see one of my heroes being inducted into the Social Work Hall of Fame. His name is Herman Gallegos, and he has a very rich life experience, and it would help all of us if we stop and listen to what he has to say. Thank you.
Address me as Hermano Herman.
Herman?
Yeah.
Which do you prefer?
No, not Mr. Gallegos. No, that's too formal.
You know, it's really been a pleasure. When I first found out that I have the opportunity to interview you, and I jumped at the gun and said, yes,
well,
yes, I
thank
can
you.
do it.
Thank you for that.
You are a pioneer. You're a hero in the field of social welfare and Latinos. You could have made a lot more money elsewhere. How did you get involved with social work?
My early childhood experiences had a lot to do with what I became and what influenced my behavior and my career choices. I was born in a very harsh, small mining town, rural town in Aguilar, Colorado. My father had gone to the mines in an early age, and life was very bleak and poor. But the real story in that, it was just a few miles from another little colonia called Ludlow, and it was in April of 1914 that the state militia was called out to quell a strike that the miners were involved with. The miners left the company housing and formed a tent city in Ludlow. And then when the state militia was called out under the auspices of the Colorado Fuel and Iron that was accepting the coke and the coal for the steel that was being produced at that time out of Pueblo, the state militia opened up fire, and women and children were machine gunned, and many of the children were suffocated in the dirt cellars that had been dug to protect themselves against the cold. So today there is a monument in Ludlow, and many of the people there are Latino names, women and children, Spanish surnames. So when I grew up, my father was very adamant about the issues of social justice and the need to treat workers, and at that time the issues of capital and labor were very striking, and labor busting was not unusual, or head busting. So I grew up with that history of how my families had been treated and the generations treated there. So when we left our first home to go to New Mexico, my father went into mining until they said that he was in danger of getting black lung disease, so then we moved to California, to San Francisco. So that was one of the stories that influenced my life, the issue of social justice for working people. The second thing happened was that we were there in the middle of the Depression. And today, when you hear all this bashing about government and getting government off our backs, or less government, I learned at an early age how appropriate it was for government to be involved, because during Roosevelt's tenure, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was set up, and my father was able to get some work. There was also the John O'Connell night school, so my dad went to night school and learned welding and blueprint reading, and so when jobs opened up, he was able to move. So again, thanks to government, in this case county government, we improved our lives. And then in school we had fresh fruit and milk and crackers that had been delivered by the Department of Agriculture for kids who could not afford that. So again, we were grateful, not dependent, but grateful to government for that help. But I also learned the third situation was a personal one, in that when I was 9 years old, I lost my left leg above the knee. And that was very traumatic for me, because I suffered considerable pain, but along the way I also began to realize that minorities and other folks suffer great disparities because of who they are, not just losing a leg, although people with disabilities, of course, encountered many obstacles. And what that did for me was that going to the county hospital, losing a leg, coming home, my parents were still not out of the woods yet financially. I think we were paying $16 a month for rent, and a new leg, they called them wooden legs, that were literally carved out of wood, cost $125. The leg I'm wearing today is like $30,000. So it's bit of inflation. But fortunately, my sixth grade teacher, Genevieve T. Lang, referred my family to a social agency called the Cripple Children's Society. Today it's called Easter Seals. Mm-hmm. And one day, two well-coiffured ladies knocked on the door of my home. They were wearing, I'll never forget this long fur coats, almost down to their ankles. Wow. They were very well dressed. And they came into the kitchen and sat with my mother and visited. And I learned later from the principal, or through the discussion, that what impressed them more than anything else, my mother kept a very neat house, and that the tablecloth on the kitchen table was practically bleached. It was so well worn. And in the corner where it was on the edge of the table, it was very neatly sewed together and darned, and that so impressed them, because many people by this time would have thrown that thing in the rag bin. But so I got my first leg, and I really learned, the whole idea. They used to call it more charity rather than assistance in this case. So here I benefited personally by government, and I benefited at a very early age the benefits of the non-for-profit sector and the art of helping people. But then along the way, there were no teachers that were Hispanic, no role models. There were no bilingual classes. When I got to high school, even though my grades were good, the counselor said, you shouldn't think about going to college because your family is too poor, you can't afford it. I went anyway. So I realized that enduring pain comes in many forms. And then I transferred to San Jose State because several of my professors in the social work school refused to sign what was then called the loyalty oath. The Levering Act required instructors to sign a loyalty oath to prove they weren't communist. And one was Dr. John Beecher, the other Herbert Bisnow. And so one day state police walked into Dr. Beecher's office and handed him order to vacate because he didn't sign the loyalty oath. Years later, the Supreme Court overturned that. John Beecher was reinstated to San Francisco State, but by this time he was really near the end of his life on oxygen and not doing well. But I did have a chance to renew my relationship with Dr. Beecher. Quick story on that is that when I was in his class, I wrote a paper, and he gave me the paper back, said AF. And I was shocked, and I said, why? He said, you quoted, some notable professors about delinquency. I wanted a paper about you, what you think, what you're doing or want to do. So I rewrote the paper and I got an A. So about 35, almost 40 years later, when I went to visit Dr. Beecher, we talked, and I didn't expect him to remember me that well. He said, I have something for you. He went, pulled a file out, and there was the original paper that I had written. He said, what I had planned to do was to write a book about students I had met to compare what happened to them. Did they ever live up or measure to their idealism they had when they were young 18-year-olds or 17-year-olds? So I was greatly influenced. That's how I ended up in East San Jose. I was working in a near Salsipuedes on Alum Rock Avenue, the Star and Bar station, and met many of the people there from Salsipuedes. Just get out if you can. And then met Fred Ross and got into house meetings and into community organizing.
Wow. That's amazing. There are many lessons one could draw from your life experiences. I'm concerned about how did you think of yourself? Physical labor was out once you lost.
Although working in a gasoline station isn't exactly mental.
But you did develop the mental capacities. And,
Well, what happened on that was that I had taken tests in high school with the State Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. And apparently I had done quite well in the test, and the counselor said, did I want to see a psychiatrist? And I asked him why. He said, people who test as high as you do generally have problems, and maybe you'd want to talk to somebody. And I said, no, I don't think so. Well, Never heard from him again. And I went through all my 4 years of college, working in gasoline stations, digging up gardens and so on. A month before I graduated from San Jose State University, an elderly gentleman came up to me with a check. Herman Gallegos, yes. Gave me a check for $35. Apparently, I had fallen through the cracks, and I could have been eligible for a stipend on a weekly basis, my books and tuitions paid for. So I laugh now about it. I said, well, it builds a lot of character. I've got so much character, I don't know what to do with it. So the bureaucracy doesn't always work smoothly, but I benefited, or could have benefited greatly by that help. But I think, hard work didn't kill me. It changed my life, and it made me appreciate what people go through too.
So once you got your degree out of San Jose, where did you
Well, I went to work on Skid Row in Santa Clara County.
Skid Row.
Well, there used to be a North First Street, South First Street. It used to be all single resident. And since
SROs, huh?
yes, since most of the department were women, there must have been 80 social workers, and I'd say all but 5 or 6 were women. I mean, all of them were women except men. In fact, there was no facility for men, so rain or shine, we had to go to the Bob Coyle gasoline station in the corner because there was no restroom for the men inside. So I got to appreciate I thought that the social work profession had a negative reputation. The term welfare was very negative. And part of the reason is that the social workers at that time had to enforce some terrible regulations. For example, the old age assistance for older people, old age security, required families to be responsible for the parents. And so we had to find out how much money the children could contribute to the support of their parents. And of course, the parents just didn't want to be dependent on their kids. And it was just a dreadful exercise to ask the children or the parents, what kind of assets do your kids have. It was very distasteful, and the department had to enforce that regulation. And similarly with child support, it was an enforcement mechanism, and the department had a lot of pressure to find people. So in the beginning, I would say that the reputation of the social work profession was not as good as it is today, because most of the people did not have advanced degrees, and many floated into that work without having degrees. But I had done some field work at the welfare department, and I managed to go there. But I have always come to appreciate the social casework experience. And then I was recruited to work as a juvenile probation officer next door.
Across the street.
Yes. And I was assigned to the east side where Mexican-American kids were getting a difficulty. One time there was a headline in the San Jose Mercury News that said, Mexican rat packs run wild in the east side. So Cesar Chavez and I went to see Joseph Ritter, the publisher, and said, look, anytime an Irish American or German American gets into trouble, you don't identify them by their ethnicity. Why are you identifying Mexican or Mexican Americans? And they said, you're right, so they stopped it. But it didn't stop the fact that kids from the east side were being brought into juvenile hall because they had long hair, wore black clothing, spoke Spanish on the school grounds. And I was constantly battling Lieutenant Green and the police department because I was letting them out as fast as they would come in. And the kids who were caught for comparable offenses were sent home. So that program was a wonder. I would have been happy to stay there as a professional work, but there was no prevention, and as soon as you cleared out your caseload, you were getting another mountain. And I felt I had to do some work that would be more in the field of preventing and getting at the root causes of it. Not that I didn't feel that casework and group work and the other fields of interest weren't as important. It's just that that's how I gravitated more into the field of community organizing, because I spent many years working with Saul Alinsky and Fred Ross in organizing the community service organization, which became a statewide Hispanic advocacy group that engaged in voter registration, voter education, get out the vote campaigns, passing civil rights legislation. We worked to help neighborhoods to get street lights and stop signs.
Pavements.
And pavements, that's exactly. But today, and I don't think CSO can take credit for that, but you can go to the east side of San Jose, or you can go to many of the barrios where we worked in Casablanca or in Boyle Heights. You'll see physical improvements there that got started because of this advocacy. But the fact is that it laid the groundwork for future social change. And that's what was key. And so today, many aspects of San Jose are very progressive. Maxa, for example, that Lino Lopez helped to start, became a magnificent organization, and still is. And I mean, it's had its issues, but what I'm saying, though, its growth was phenomenal. And you have programs like SET, the Employment and Training Program, which is marvelous. So there's a rich history. Plus, look at all the public officials that a community like San Jose has. And all of that had its roots with early voter registration. While CSO doesn't claim for that, it just had planted the seeds for how we could bring about social responsible change.
Well, what I hear behind everything that you have said is that you were keenly aware of how practice, social work practice,
Right.
is controlled by policy.
Right. Right.
And the importance of policy.
Right.
So from the very beginning, you were very, you had a high critical consciousness, if I can use that word, in the implications of policy. And then, of course, then you chose community organizing to bring about change.
I did, but I made a decision to go back to school to get my master's degree.
And where did you go?
At Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and
Wiltsey, was he there?
Kermit Wilsey was one of my professors. And by special arrangement, there were two of us that were given the permission to take courses that would lead to something called community organization, but there was no real division that specialized in it. So they gave us a lot of group work and public policy classes, and Ms. Gertrude Wilson was there, and I almost flunked her class because she passed out a bibliography, and the very first day I looked at it, and the first name was Alinsky, Saul David. Well, I'd worked with Alinsky, and we were mentors and friends. I said, well, this is going to be a slam dunk. Well, I got it from Gertrude. She says, you're a bit arrogant. She says, Alinsky doesn't have a monopoly on how to organize communities. There are other ways by which we organize and bring about responsible change. And maybe you have
to rub the source of humanity raw.
So maybe you just ought to try to open your eyes and your mind to looking at how else, society can be changed. And I was always very grateful to her. And I passed her class, and I became an enthusiast about learning about other things in life. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made. Shortly before I graduated, Saul Alinsky and Fred Ross Saul flew out from Chicago to recruit me to be an organizer in LA. This was to happen as soon as I was going to graduate. And
Is that where you worked in Boyle Heights?
I would have been in Boyle Heights, yes. So I turned him down.
Oh.
It would have paid, at that time, 1958, $9,000 a year, which was a king's ransom. And so my first job in the welfare department was $227 a month, and the probation department was like $450. So I was getting on in the world. So $9,000 was a pretty good fit. But I turned him down because I felt that I wanted to be myself. That I didn't want to be like Alinsky. I couldn't be like him. It was impossible. He was just one of a kind. And I also felt that I had learned some things in school that allowed me to broaden my horizons, even beyond organizing. I felt very committed to organizing and felt I would continue. In fact, my first job after graduation was in San Bernardino County. A social worker recruited me, and so I spent time in San Bernardino County in the Victor Valley in the high desert, helping to organize community services. Victorville, Apple Valley, Barstow, Yermo, Hinckley, Needles, you name it. It was 22,000 miles of desert and jackrabbits. And I did quite well there, but the best thing that happened was that I was working with money from the Rosenberg Foundation. And Ruth Chance, who was then executive director, and Leslie Ganyard, who was her predecessor, came to visit and check out what we were doing, I was doing. And the thing about it is that we became very close friends. And it was through Ruth Chance that later, when I moved up to north of San Francisco, that Ruth recruited me to be one of the first Latinos on a foundation board, Rosenberg Foundation. But while I was in the San Bernardino County area, it was a lot of the racial conflict, a lot of the problems with blacks who lived there. They were worried about where I was going to live. One day after church, I wanted to take my kids swimming in a swimming pool that was almost literally next door to the Catholic Church. And I walked in, and there was a big sign that said, "White trade only." I said, "Well, how can this be?" And I asked a lady, I said, "How come you don't let Negroes swim here?" She said, "Well, they fight." And I knew there was a small colony of Asians. I said, "Well, what about Chinese?" "Oh, they bring disease." I said, "Okay, what about Mexicans?" "Well, if one of you all starts to drown, we won't be able to understand you. Now get the hell out of here." So I said to the lady, "Are you aware of the Unruh Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination in any place of business, public or private?" She told me to get out again. And I said, "Well, you're going to hear from the Attorney General of California." And Frank Williams, who was in with the AG's office, heard from me, and they filed a complaint. She closed it down rather than stay open. But today, there is an Olympic-sized swimming pool in Victorville, California, that I think is a result of that foreclosure. So.
Were you ever discouraged?
Oh yes, I think one of the factors is that when you're with a member of a minority group that had no solid base of organization and existence to bring about change, and you're starting from scratch, you inevitably make mistakes. But I always refer to something that Ruth Chance, now she's deceased, but then the executive director of the Rosenberg Foundation, a person who helped me immensely to think through a lot of these things. What she said, we need to be modest about what we believe about the things we are doing. She said that you can be sure that over time, time will sometimes change or force you to change or ruin the solutions that you've been working on. But that time of experimentation and fomentation can be a time also for great evaluation, to evaluate what you have done, and why it didn't work as well, what could have happened to make it better. She said, but that time of evaluation gives you an opportunity to either absorb the things that you feel worked, you can modify what you did, or you can discard it. But that this doesn't necessarily preclude your working on the issues you believe in at the time. She said, because what can happen is that the pendulum can swing the other way. And then just possibly you can start over again and what you were working on will inch forward, or maybe somebody else will pick it up. But it does help one to understand just how complex and how remote some solutions are. And I think that sometimes when we're eager and we're starting out, we forget that sometimes there are some solutions that are very remote and they're very complex. And I'll give you one quick example, and that's AIDS. When the AIDS epidemic came out, people were not quite hysterical, but very concerned about what is this disease, where does it come from, how does it transmit itself, what are we going to do if the hospitals get filled up, if the disease is causing people to be hospitalized and dying or whatever. And so recognizing that there was to be no immediate solution, no vaccine or drug, whatever, the best thing that happened, certainly coming out of San Francisco, was managing the problem better. We said, look, until we find a cure, we must manage the problem better in the workplace, how people engage, because they weren't sure whether it was spread through breathing or saliva or handshakes or whatever. So I think, at least out of the United States, there was a wonderful process of managing a serious problem. And we haven't solved it. We know how to avoid it and how to control it better, but in the main, we still have a long way to go. Another example would be the farm worker struggle. Long before Cesar Chavez became a household name, Dr. Ernesto Galarza was in the fields organizing workers. And not only that, but he profiled agribusiness, merchants of labor, strangers in the field, barrio boy, which is a classic. So Ernesto did all of this research.
A lot of foundation.
But no one, when you talk about farm workers, nobody even thinks about him. And for example, I remember in talking to Chavez about research, and he said, you can't change anything with research. He had a contempt for research. And yet if there was anyone that benefited from research, particularly Galarza's research, was Cesar. And so Ernesto laid down the ground for ending the bracero program, a form of contract labor between the U.S. and Mexico that brought farm workers here. But what happened was that I mentioned a moment ago that sometimes the pendulum will swing the other way. And by the time Cesar began to organize in Delano, we had already had the beginning of the anti-poverty program with first Kennedy and Johnson. And so we had Vista volunteers. We became concerned about white Appalachians. We became concerned about southern sharecroppers. We became concerned about farm workers and migrant workers. So that by that time, Cesar was overflowing with young Anglo volunteers, former nuns and priests who were well-educated. And even though Cesar said he was going to build a union of farm workers for farm workers, 90% of the people were folks who had left their jobs to help. So I'm saying is that timing can be a factor. So it was not a factor when Galarza was organizing, but his books are classics and they're a legacy. And I really urge students to read those because it shows the power of research and how it can influence our thinking to understand a problem better. And that's so important as we go forward in problem solving.
I have very fond memories of Dr. Galarza, and I could not understand how a congressional resolution that carries no real force of law,
right,
that was initiated by Nixon,
that's right,
could have defeated him.
That's right. Well, it seemed to me, again, the times, the bureaucracy, the Department of Labor were clearly in the hands of growers, and there was no public opinion or sympathy, and then Galarza had no support from foundations or laborers to fight this, in the courts, whatever he did out of his own pocket. But again, and I remember visiting with Don Ernesto before he passed away, and I used to visit with him and May Galarza's wife frequently. Yeah. And when I went to see Ernesto, I said, Ernie, you seem a little down. I said, ¿Qué pasa? What's up? He said, well, I think he was kind of feeling discouraged about some aspects of his life. And I said, why don't you go back to writing? Now, you do it so brilliantly, and whatever you read, will be read, and it'll be very helpful. He said, no, Gallegos. He said, look, he says, you don't write from behind a desk. You've got to be out there where the people and the action is. He says, that's what I've always done with my life. And that's what I would do if I were going to do that. He said, but I don't have the energy, the time, the resources to be able to do that. And I think that's a very important message, that we always have to be where the people are and to learn from that experience rather than thinking that we can know what people are thinking and want, And I think that's what grew out of the community organization experience I had, is we learned the power of organizing, for example, developing one-on-ones to sit down and talk with a person from the area, the community, not to ask, what problems do you think we should solve, but rather, what's your name? Where do you work? Tell me about your family. It was a matter of building trust one-on-ones. Then that led to house meetings. We'd have 8 to 10 people there. Fred Ross would talk about how he had organized in East LA and fought police brutality, and so we were just awed by that. And then that led to about 8 weeks of voter registration work, door-to-door work. We had to fight the registrar of voters, John Tustin, to get deputies. And then we led to a school at the Mayfair School in East San Jose. Bob McGuire was the principal. And there we established an organization. So I was nominated as president. I was at the age of just barely turned 22, and Cesar was my first vice. And so I had nominated Cesar and given a speech, and I forgot who nominated me, but anyway, the election was held, and I won, and Cesar won. So we went up to Fred. We were ecstatic. Fred, we can't believe it. We won. We won. We didn't think our speeches were that great. He said, they weren't. He said, well, how come we won? He said, hey, Who do you think was out there for the last 8 weeks going door to door? Did you see John Flores, who was running against you, do any work? Was he out once doing voter registration at all, helping? You know, the people were not fooled by simply great speeches and great promises. They know who was doing the work. So that was a lesson learned for us at a very early age, was to reinforce the idea that it was really the doing that really counted, you know. And so from there, we really put our trust in the hands of a democratically run organization, even if we're all of 22 years old, and then later I became first vice, then later national president, and Cesar national executive director, and we launched an unprecedented statewide voter registration campaign that was really fantastic. So again, very rewarding, rewarding times, and I'm so grateful for those experiences.
But you had your ups and you had your downs.
Yes,
What
of
about
course.
your support group?
Well, I had many individuals that took an interest in me. I think I had the good sense, or intuitively, to listen to people older than myself. I remember working at a settlement house in Potrero Hill, a neighborhood house. Amelia Anderson, who was a person who was there, and she took me under her wing and exposed me to group work and social work. And then later, unbeknown to me, I ended up working with her in the welfare department. She was one of the first pioneers in the field of aging, and she pleaded with me to go to school and get a doctorate in gerontology. She says, that's going to be the big thing. And she also told me to buy real estate in Warm Springs, which I didn't do. And
Warren Springs, did you say one?
I didn't listen to her advice, and she became a very wealthy woman. She passed away. So, and then I became, of course, Alinsky and Ross. There was a Father Don McDonald, who was a genius,
Of course, yes.
a saintly man who instructed Cesar and all of us on the theology of how, you know, things work. It's not just change, but understanding the values we live by, that we cannot lose sight of, you know, who we are and what we're doing, why we're doing it. And so Don and Father former John Dugan, Jerry Cox, and then there was Tom McCullough and John Garcia.
Eugene Boyle.
Eugene Boyle. When I went back into San Francisco, Monsignor Boyle was very involved. I got involved in the Catholic Interracial Council with a lot of young Irish who really taught me a lot, really role models for us. And I think that out of that came something that we alluded to just kind of informally chit-chatting, is that I learned that it was very important to be inclusive in my thinking. And as I met with very militant young Chicanos during the student movement, Chicano movement.
Who were angry and hurt.
Very angry and hurt. I said, look, it's not our job to become someone else's oppressor. You know, our job is to be certain that we help those who are being hurt and left behind, and it's not our job to add to their misery, regardless of who their color, their gender, etc. So we've got to cut that out. And I, with Henry Santiesteban in 1968, we were very concerned about the turn toward violence among our Chicano people. And so we came out with a pledge to nonviolence, in which we were supporting the fast and the work that Cesar was doing in Delano. And in this pledge, we basically said that violence will destroy far more than we hope to create, so that we again emphasize that we should place our hopes on democratically run community organizations, and we will have change, but we must work for it. And so we were able to overcome that, but for people who took a moderate position, who weren't mau-mauing to the extreme, we were under a lot of criticism, because we were not as militant as, say, Reyes Tejerina or as Corky Gonzalez and so on. But then when you look at things historically, here 40-something years, what did I leave behind? You know, the National Council, La Raza would be one, Hispanics and Philanthropy would be another, locally to be Arriba Juntos and other organizations. And so...
And also the School of Social Work at San Jose State.
Right.
You were there at a very crucial point.
So I think that, you know, being inclusive and diversity, and I think one of the things that I found out when I joined the foundation world that is very elite, even today, 88% of the trustees are white males. And I found out that I was one of the only Latinos on a board of trustees of a foundation. Then when I was invited to serve on the Rockefeller Foundation, there were 4 African Americans on that board. And I'm the first Latino ever to serve on that. So when they talked about a minority program in Atlanta, they really meant a black program. So I had to work to change that vocabulary to be more inclusive. And so people like Vernon Jordan and Eleanor Holmes Norton and others were more amenable to understanding that there were more problems in this country than beyond one group. But that kind of change is very difficult. And today, you know, foundations are still notorious in not being inclusive enough, and staff levels and trustee levels. Part of it is we need to do more of exposing young social workers to the possibilities of looking at philanthropy. We become engaged in the nonprofit sector maybe through the delivery of service programs. And there are a lot of foundation grants given for capacity building grants to strengthen the ability of nonprofits to improve their governance and fundraising. But what I believe is missing, if you were to ask me, is there anything that I feel is still missing? I would say yes.
In social work education?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. That I think that both in the training and education and fieldwork practicum, is that we need to go back to appreciate that the training and development of indigenous community-based leadership is going to be key to change. Because
repeat that again.
That the training, development of indigenous community-based leadership is the great hope for change in this country. That I think that the social worker can be, like a Saul Alinsky Fred Ross, can be an enabler. But the enabler doesn't speak for that community group. It doesn't impose his or her will on that group. Right. The change, the idea, passion for change must be seized, you know, by the people themselves to see their possibilities of hope for change. And that means organizing, starting the hard way, one-on-ones, learning how to be an enabler and a helper. So I'm all for what nonprofits are doing in terms of employment and training programs and so on. But who is doing the training of indigenous community-based leadership, of barrio leadership, so that folks are able to negotiate with power because they realize they are now part of power and they are respected. I remember one time when some of us were complaining to Sam Della Maggiore, who was then a supervisor in East San Jose, and complaining there were no recreation facilities in East San Jose. Sam showed up the next day in my office with a basketball. I mean, that was his answer to solving and it was only after we continued to register and to vote that then the Department of Parks Recreation began, and the county manager, city manager began to pay attention to us. It's only by developing that nuancing the power and handling power, because Alinsky used to warn us about the seduction of power. There's some people who can have a glass of wine and it goes to their head. Other people can drink half a bottle like me and it doesn't affect me. Well, I don't think so, ask my wife. But, but the point is that he warned against the issues of power. And I have learned over time that the cult of personality is very dangerous, to be led by the personality or someone by the so-called charismatic leader. Ernesto Galarza, Dr. Galarza, used to warn, he said, be very careful not to depend on the so-called charismatic leader. Because if that person dies or leaves, if he or she has not left behind a solid base of organization, the organization will collapse. And so he also warned against taking money and depending on the compassion of others to survive. He said, you know, what happens is a liberal group will support you and then the well springs of compassion will soon run dry. They'll go on to another cause. And if you have not learned how to develop a self-sustaining mode of operation, you'll collapse. Or you become very dependent, like the politicians who depend on the lobbyists for survival.
Do you think that the typical social work student understands the concept of power? Or how well, in your experience?
My sense is that most social workers, if they will look into where they're going, were certainly made aware of power as I became aware of the fact that I had to enforce some very negative laws in terms of old age security, responsible relatives, and so on, doing the dirty work. And then even today, for example, government will cut back programs and we have to enforce those things. But that's power at work. And it seemed to me that rather than complain about it, that we need to figure out how do we change that? How do we confront those power streams? And we need to look at what are the teaching modes for helping us to understand that? For example, I don't think there's any problem with having somebody like Ernie Cortez, who's with the Industrial Areas Foundation with UNO in LA. They turned out 15,000 people, parents, to negotiate with the school district to deal with educational curriculum. Well, he's not a social worker. He's a MacArthur genius formerly. But he could tell you about power, and so I think we need to have some exchange.
That's one of the sources of power that Alinsky identified.
Right.
Organized numbers of people for a given end, organized for a given end.
Right.
One of the sources of
Right.
power.
Right.
But Alinsky also says that knowledge, knowing what to do, when and where,
Right.
and how and for what, is
Right.
another source of power.
Right,
And
exactly.
then the third source of power that Alinsky identifies is money or access to money.
Right,
And
exactly.
have you discovered any other sources of power in your years of experience? Which ones have you used the most?
Well, we've learned the power of collaboration. Very early, we cooperated with the NAACP, Jewish Labor Council, Councils for Civic Unity, American Friends Service Committee, religious groups, faith-based organizations, to learn the power of engagement so that together we were able to pass fair employment practice legislation or fair housing legislation. And it's by working collaboratively, not in informal,
Herman, that's an old Mexican saying. Una mano lava la otra.
That's right.
Los dos lavan
That's
la
right.
cara.
That's right.
For the well-being of the body. You
That's
know.
right.
One here washes the other.
Exactly.
And then both wash the face for the well-being of the body.
But we learned very early that that's true. Collaboration, one hand washes the other, and we need to be sensitive to, are there internship opportunities, are there mentors and folks. I was very influenced by a Cuban Negro, an MSW graduate, Evelio Grillo, who was raised in, he left his family to go to school, he got his MSW, and Evelio was very influential in helping me in thinking about graduate school. But he also opened up doors in the black community. And it was Evelio that helped me to get a John Hay Whitney Opportunity Fellowship.
John Hay Whitney, yes.
And I never would have gone to graduate school if it hadn't been for Evelio getting after me too. But Evelio also said something else, because it's so seductive to allow yourself to be seduced by the idea that you're so damn important, that people can't do without you, that you've got to accept this chairmanship or this committee assignment. And so you allow yourself to be seduced and thinking how important you are. When in reality, there are hundreds of other people who could do it. And we have to learn how to say no. But somehow we put ourselves in a position, well, maybe this would give me a little stepping stone or power relation to do that. And as I said earlier, I think sometimes we have to be just a little bit modest in judging what we think we're doing. And the other...
You're very humble. By that I
thank you.
mean you admit the truth.
Right.
You're capable of seeing the truth.
Right.
What formed you this way? Was it a strong religious background?
I believe so, although I was not raised in a formal Catholic setting, but I did go to church. But when I met someone like Father McDonald and Dugan and other priests who were really out of the mainstream, basically, then my eyes really opened up to the encyclicals of the church and to the purpose of how one lives their faith, the gospel, and try to put into practice the teachings of one's faith, and also to be very open and ecumenical, to be very joyous in the idea of working with other denominations across lines, and to learn from those. I think if I had any advice to a young social worker, don't be surprised about what you're going to learn. Keep your mind very open, and beyond that, don't be surprised where your career takes you. I had no idea, and I had never thought that whatever I was doing was going to lead me from the barrio to the boardrooms, to the hollowed halls of power of corporate America, to be on the board of directors of AT&T, for example. For 30 years, I started first with Pacific Telephone Telegraph Company, the first Latino, one of the few in America to serve on a corporate board. Became Pacific Telesys, we divested from AT&T, then we became SBC, and then we put back together with AT&T. In 30 years, I went to every board meeting, every committee meeting, and there were a lot of meetings, and in 30 years, never missed a board or committee meeting. So you can say that board members go to a lot of meetings, you have to be well read. But being the first on such a board You have to learn how to develop relationship, collegiality. You need to learn how to deal with the benefits that you're there in servant leadership. You're not there to be erase yourself or leave the community behind you. Although, after I'd been elected to my first board, the community said, he's a bandito, he's a sellout. He joined the establishment. Part of it is a lot of our people don't appreciate the value of what the good things that corporate America does, creating good paying jobs. We had always had good relationship with the SEIU unions, for example, or good benefits and so on. Yeah, and I don't believe in unbridled capitalism, a capitalism where there are no labor laws or child labor laws or safety or environmental regulations. No, I don't believe in that. But I do believe in corporate social responsibility. We would give away $100 million a year for social programs. And so I've seen the best, and I've also seen some of the worst of what corporations are about. But I'm not prepared to write off corporate America just because at a certain point in our history, you know, they're not doing that great. Like the banks, I think, and I've been on a bank board that was owned by Japanese. So don't be surprised at where your career takes you, but always be ready to accept responsibility, whatever that calling is. And sometimes you don't know why you're being called to do those things. But the one thing that you do is you never lose your values. You never lose your sense of purpose of what you're about. Yeah, you can, all of a sudden you're wearing a suit and tie as opposed to a shirt, you know, from the barrio. And then perhaps you watch your language a little more carefully. But you never lose sight of who you are. And just very quickly, for example, I admire the fact that IBM is just celebrating 101 years, the beginning of their 101st year as a company. And what they were saying, that the company today is not the same company that Thomas Watson Sr. started when he started the company. So what has kept the company going? Were it the products that they developed? They said no, they list all of the products that they discarded. There were many, many that had a value enterprise that they discarded because they didn't feel it was keeping with their corporate culture. But what the one thing that has sustained and will sustain that organization are certain beliefs, value systems, and culture, you know, about who they are. He said, Thomas Watson Sr. would not recognize the products, but he would recognize an IBMer, what they stand for. And I think that's what's important, is what do we stand for? We cannot be like anybody else. I've had people comparing me to others, and I said, look, I'm glad I'm not like that person, because I'm here and he's not, he's gone. But the other problem is that I think that we need to be ourselves, you know, for better, for worse.
Our authentic self.
Yeah. We just need to be satisfied at knowing that maybe we're not always going to be naive and inexperienced, but we're going to try like heck to try to make the most out of our lives so we can be better servants and helpers, you know. It will change. And sometimes I'm just in awe over the range of experiences that have happened out of college, out of the university. And then when I was asked, and I've never applied, to be on a corporate board or to be on a foundation board, it wasn't because I'd applied. You know, I got a call and they would say, would you be willing to consider this, you know? So I was able to open my eyes to the possibilities that, well, maybe I could be helpful there. So,
well, you were open to growth.
Right.
But a lot of things are happening right now in America. I see my grandnephew that lives with me. I don't think he'll be able to retire from a job with benefits like I have.
Right.
He's a freelancer. Mm-hmm. And even though he does belong to a union, he's into media broadcasting. Mm-hmm. Degree from San Francisco State, which is supposedly is one of the best places for that. Occupy America is now happening. Should social workers be there? What's your advice to professional organizations and schools of social work regarding this movement that's happening?
Well, there's no end to the number of issues that are facing the American public, the 99ers particularly. there's just no end facing Hispanics in terms of what is irreducibly a Latino issue, or really the issues of America. The immigration gets noticed, but there are other issues, the unemployment issue and so on. But it seemed to me that we need to look at what are those, that process that has worked to help the profession to sustain itself. The use of self sounds rather schoolish, but it's so important. How we use ourselves in a casework, an individual, how we use ourselves in a group situation, how we use ourselves in a community situation. What is our role? How can we be enablers? And I use that broadly, that over time our role will change, but we sustain those values. Charlotte Tolle's Common Human Needs.
Common Human Needs.
Very fundamental.
The only book that was ever burned in America.
So we need to constantly be vigilant for the opportunities for change. And by the way, if you want to get rich, you don't join the social work profession. What I'm saying is that most of the work that I've done did not enjoy, pension benefits and the lucrative finances and so on. My dad used to worry. He says, "Aren't you afraid you're going to lose your job? I mean, you're taking all these chances, picketing and doing these things." And I would say, no, somehow God will provide, But I have a quick story how you never know how your life will inform or cross lines that you never know would happen. For example, I mentioned Ludlow, Colorado, near where I was born. Ludlow was the site of the Ludlow massacre. The Colorado Iron and Fuel major shareholder was John D. Rockefeller, who later went on to start the Rockefeller Foundation. So in the early 80s, I was asked to join the Rockefeller Foundation. So I went to visit my dad, and first thing he would always ask is, "What's new?" Standard question, "What's new?" I said, "Dad, I just joined the board of the Rockefeller Foundation." I thought he was going to jump off his seat. He said, "The what? Rockefeller? What are you doing with that?" I said, "Dad, I joined the board." "Well, what's that? What do you do?" I said, "Well, we give his money away." "Give his money away? Well, how much money do you give?" I said, "Well, I think we'll give away $100 million this year." "For what?" And I said, "Well, we do international securities issues, agriculture, arts and humanities, and so on." He said, "Well, that sounds good." So next time I'd go see him, "How are you doing giving away Mr. Rockefeller's money?" And I said, "Dad, I hate to tell you, but actually the foundation is worth more now than the last time we talked because the stock markets have been very good. So we have more money to give away, so we're working harder to get that." And my dad never, I think to the day he died, never understood how people could enjoy, this challenge of giving away money, and yet there was so many problems, you couldn't give the money away fast enough. And I think there's a lesson in that money alone will not help us to solve all of these problems. In the end, it seems to me, it's the people themselves who will drive change, 99 that I think we need to support and speak to. That you can take whatever issue you want, but it's how we manage to develop a change and the public opinion. And that's what this fight is all about. The Tea Party and the 99s is about capturing the imagination of the American public for the public opinion. But out of that, I hope that we go back to appreciating the role of government, the role of service, and beyond the idea of some people opting for the individual to take care of himself, that we have a responsibility to each other and to our community. And so I think that it's difficult, but this too will pass. That as bleak as it seems.
Santa Teresa of Avila.
And I've never seen it as bad as it is. The rhetoric, the hatred that comes out of Washington is so disappointing. But it'll change. And we need to be there to pick up the pieces and to make it change, So I think going forward, the profession of social work has so much to offer this country. I think the question the social work profession needs to ask itself, that 10 years from now or even today, is that were we being too timid or not aggressive enough in bringing about change? So who knows? I think that's an answer that we all have to ask ourselves, because it's so easy to be nice and accommodating, but the danger is we end up being handmaidens to power instead of being a force for change.
You haven't spoken yet about technology.
Right.
And, the computers and
right.
the iPods and
Right,
everything.
exactly.
Where does that fit in
Well,
the social work culture?
Well, it just seemed to me that there are faster ways of communicating. I worry, though, that if you put all these computers in the classroom, or you get wired up, don't we still need the human touch, the human person in the classroom? And the same thing in social work. Talk about civic participation. You can mobilize 100,000 people to turn out against immigration problems. I mean, for immigration reform, but you can turn out people, but is that really a movement? I mean, it's one day, people turn out, but have they learned how to trust the guy who's standing next to you or the person next to you? Have they learned how to engage with that person with trust and to build an ongoing, sustaining organization, so once that issue cools off, that the people are still mobilized to take on the next issue? And so we always have to be prepared for the next issue, not just be one issue, a group. So I think that the technology for mobilizing us to turn out is great. And we get people to go to a rally, something like that. But you get people all fired up, but what is the permanency of that? And for me, I think the human aspect of it is so important. And that's where I think that we, as social workers who appreciate the rapport and relationship that you establish with clients and with communities, is sustained over time, and that there's no quick fix. Building trust and confidence and being a helping person is more than just a quick flash in the pan, So I'm all for technology, but not a nerd myself, but it's helpful.
Well, as you know, Herman, to whom much is given, much is expected.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly.
And
Well, my sense is that we have an obligation to give back. I mean, all of the good things that have ever happened to me are the result of things that have happened because people took an interest in me. God gave me certain talents and skills, but I was nurtured and motivated by so many other folks. The list is too long to mention at this moment. But I think the important thing is that we never give up hope. We never stop giving back in whatever way we can do it. And maybe it's the boardroom, maybe it's in a casework situation, but we always find ways to give back. I mean, that will further nurture us and reward us because we will see responsible social change happen on the part of individuals and groups and communities. So, we need to appreciate what we do more because for too long, I think social workers have never really been given the credit they deserve for the good they're doing in this country. And we cannot allow the forces of evil and obstructionism to demean the profession or to cut back on the services that are provided to those who are most needing in this country. We have to defend that. And so I'm very grateful that this profession allows me to do a lot of social in the work. It's a big field.
It's been an honor meeting with you.
Thank you.
And I hope that people will visit click on your name at the Hall of Distinction and hear this, play this tape.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Gracias.
Gracias.